The fluorescent lights in Conference Room B at Motown Records buzzed with a mechanical persistence that matched the tension in Barry Gordy's voice. It was May 1971, and Marvin Gaye sat across from the man who had built an empire on the promise of making black music palatable to white America. Between them lay an acetate demo that would either revolutionize soul music or destroy everything Motown had worked to achieve. Barry's fingers drummed against the mahogany table as he delivered his verdict with the cold certainty of a judge pronouncing a death sentence. "This album will never see the light of day, Marvin. Not under the Motown label, not while I'm alive." Marvin stared at the demo, its silver surface reflecting the harsh office lighting like a mirror he couldn't bear to look into. What's Going On wasn't just an album to him. It was a confession, a prayer, a desperate attempt to make sense of a world that had taken his duet partner Tammy Terrell and was now devouring young black men in the jungles of Vietnam. But to Barry, it was a commercial suicide note written in social consciousness and political awareness that could alienate the very audience that had made them both rich. The silence stretched between them like a chasm that neither man knew how to bridge. Marvin had spent months crafting these songs, pouring his grief over Tammy's death and his brother Frankie's traumatic return from Vietnam into melodies that asked the questions no one else seemed brave enough to voice. Why was there so much suffering? Why were young men dying in foreign countries for causes they didn't understand? Why did the powerful profit while the innocent suffered? These weren't the romantic fantasies that Motown specialized in. These were uncomfortable truths that demanded uncomfortable answers. Barry leaned back in his leather chair, his expression softening slightly as he tried to explain his position. He reminded Marvin of the success they had achieved together, the millions of records sold, the barriers broken down by keeping their message universal rather than political. He spoke about the delicate balance they had maintained, creating music that black audiences could relate to while avoiding anything that might threaten white consumers or radio programmers. What's Going On wasn't just a departure from that formula. It was a complete rejection of everything Motown represented. But Marvin wasn't listening to the business logic anymore. He was thinking about the conversations he had shared with Tammy during those long hospital visits, about her encouragement to use his platform to speak truth rather than just sell dreams. He was remembering his brother's hollow eyes when Frankie described the horrors he had witnessed in Southeast Asia, the way his hands shook when helicopters flew overhead, the nightmares that woke him screaming in the middle of the night. Marvin had promised himself that Tammy's death and Frankie's trauma wouldn't be meaningless, that he would channel that pain into something that mattered. The meeting ended without resolution. Barry maintained his position that What's Going On was too political, too risky, too far removed from the Motown sound that had conquered the world. Marvin left the office feeling something he had never experienced in his relationship with the label that had made him a star. For the first time, he felt like a prisoner rather than a partner, trapped in a golden cage that demanded he sing only the songs his captors approved. That night, Marvin sat alone in his Detroit apartment, replaying the conversation over and over in his mind. He understood Barry's concerns from a business perspective. Motown had built its success on creating music that transcended racial boundaries by avoiding explicitly racial content. They had proven that black artists could achieve mainstream success without threatening the status quo, without making white audiences uncomfortable with messages that challenged their worldview. But understanding Barry's position didn't make it any less frustrating or creatively suffocating. The weeks that followed were marked by a cold war between artist and label. Barry refused to schedule studio time for What's Going On sessions. Marvin refused to record anything else. Phone calls went unanswered. Meetings were canceled. The Motown publicity machine continued to promote Marvin's existing catalog while pretending that the conflict didn't exist. But behind the scenes, everyone could feel the tension building towards something that would either resolve itself or explode spectacularly. The atmosphere at Hitsville, USA became charged with unspoken anxiety. Studio musicians who had worked with Marvin for years found themselves caught in the middle, uncertain whether to maintain loyalty to an artist they respected or to the company that employed them. Engineers whispered in hallways about the standoff, some taking sides, others desperately hoping for a resolution that would allow them to return to making music instead of navigating political landmines. Marvin's isolation during this period was almost complete. He would drive past the Motown building some days, not stopping, just observing the familiar facade that had once felt like home, but now looked more like a fortress designed to keep certain ideas out. The security guards who used to greet him warmly now avoided eye contact, aware that he had become persona non grata. The studio that had once welcomed his spontaneous visits was now off limits, its doors locked against the very artist who had helped make it famous. Marvin began to question everything about his relationship with Motown. He remembered how they had initially resisted his desire to write and produce his own material, preferring to keep him in the role of a polished performer who delivered other people's visions. The memory of those early battles felt different now, viewed through the lens of this current conflict. Back then, he had eventually worn them down through persistence and proven success. But this felt more fundamental, more about the very soul of what music could and should accomplish. He thought about how they had pushed Tammy to keep recording even when she was clearly dying, prioritizing profit over human compassion. The image of her weakened voice struggling through takes while tumor treatments ravaged her body became a symbol of everything wrong with the industry's priorities. Tammy had wanted to rest, to focus on healing, but the machine demanded product, demanded her voice even as it was failing her. The parallel to his own situation was impossible to ignore. Motown wanted his voice, but only if it sang the songs they approved. He reflected on all the compromises he had made over the years, all the songs he had recorded that felt safe rather than meaningful, all the opportunities to speak truth that he had sacrificed for commercial success. Each memory stung differently now. The romantic ballads that felt hollow when the world was burning. The dance tracks designed to make people forget their troubles rather than confront them. The carefully crafted image of the smooth lover, the sophisticated entertainer who never rocked the boat or challenged assumptions. The isolation was suffocating. Marvin found himself spending hours alone, not writing new music, but questioning whether he had sold his soul for success. He wondered if his artistic integrity had been compromised so gradually that he hadn't noticed it disappearing. The man who had once dreamed of being more than just an entertainer, who had wanted to use his voice to heal and inspire, began to feel like he had become nothing more than a well-paid puppet dancing to someone else's tune. Friends and family members who tried to mediate the dispute found themselves caught between two immovable forces. Some urged Marvin to be practical, to find a way to make the album more palatable to Barry's concerns without abandoning his vision entirely. Others encouraged him to stand firm, arguing that artists had a responsibility to speak truth regardless of commercial consequences. But Marvin had moved beyond the advice of others. This had become a defining moment that would determine not just his career trajectory, but his sense of self-worth as an artist and as a human being. The breaking point came during a heated phone conversation in late June. Barry, frustrated by months of stalemate, made what he intended as a pragmatic suggestion, but what Marvin heard as an ultimatum. If Marvin wanted to release politically conscious music, he could do it after his contract expired. Until then, he needed to record commercially viable material that served Motown's interests rather than his own artistic vision. The implication was clear: conform or find another label. Marvin's response was quiet but absolute. If Motown wouldn't release What's Going On, he would never record another note for them. He would walk away from everything they had built together rather than compromise his artistic integrity. He would become a taxi driver, a construction worker, anything that allowed him to maintain his dignity before he would return to singing love songs while the world burned around him. The silence that followed that conversation lasted for days. Barry, accustomed to artists who ultimately bent to his will when faced with the loss of their lucrative contracts, waited for Marvin to back down. But as the days turned into weeks, it became clear that this was unlike any previous negotiation. Marvin wasn't bluffing or attempting to gain leverage. He was prepared to sacrifice his career for his principles, and that realization forced Barry to confront a possibility he had never seriously considered: losing one of his biggest stars over artistic differences. The resolution came not through compromise but through calculation. Barry privately commissioned market research to determine whether What's Going On might be commercially viable despite his initial reservations. The process was exhaustive and expensive, involving focus groups, radio programmer surveys, and analysis of recent trends in popular music. Barry hired consultants who specialized in predicting cultural shifts, desperate to find data that would justify either his initial opposition or a change of heart. The research revealed uncomfortable truths about changing consumer tastes. Younger audiences, particularly Black listeners who had grown up during the civil rights movement, were becoming increasingly sophisticated in their musical preferences. They wanted artists who spoke to their lived experiences rather than escaping from them. The success of artists like James Brown, who had recorded Say It Loud, I'm Black and Proud, suggested that there was indeed a market for more politically conscious soul music. Barry spent sleepless nights reviewing the data, wrestling with his own instincts and the mounting evidence that his commercial judgment might be flawed. He spoke with radio programmers about their willingness to play socially conscious material from established artists, discovering that many were actually eager for content that distinguished their stations from competitors playing generic pop. He analyzed the success of other musicians who had ventured into political territory without destroying their careers, finding precedents that challenged his assumptions about audience tolerance for challenging material. The internal struggle within Motown's executive ranks intensified as word of the research spread. Some longtime employees argued that Barry's initial instincts were correct, that the company's success had been built on avoiding controversial content, and that departing from that formula was unnecessarily risky. Others, particularly younger staff members, argued that Motown needed to evolve or risk becoming irrelevant to a new generation of music consumers who demanded authenticity over escapism. The call came on a Tuesday evening in July. Barry's voice carried none of its usual confidence as he told Marvin that Motown would release What's Going On, but with conditions. The album would receive limited promotion initially, allowing them to gauge public response before committing fully to the project. If it failed commercially, Marvin would return to recording more traditional material. If it succeeded, they could discuss future projects of a similar nature. Marvin accepted the terms without enthusiasm or gratitude. The compromise felt like a victory that had cost too much to achieve. The months of conflict had changed his relationship with Motown permanently, transforming what had been a creative partnership into a business arrangement marked by mutual suspicion and resentment. He had gotten what he wanted, but the process had revealed truths about the music industry that he could never unsee or forget. What's Going On was released in May 1971 and immediately proved that both men had underestimated its potential impact. The album reached number 6 on the Billboard 200, received widespread critical acclaim, and established Marvin as an artist capable of addressing serious social issues without sacrificing commercial appeal. Radio stations that had initially been reluctant to play political music from a soul singer found themselves overwhelmed by listener demand. The success validated Marvin's artistic vision while forcing Barry to acknowledge that his commercial instincts hadn't been as infallible as he had believed. But success didn't heal the wounds that had been opened during those months of conflict. Marvin had learned that artistic freedom was something that had to be fought for rather than assumed, that even the most supportive record label would ultimately prioritize profit over principles when forced to choose. The trust that had once existed between artist and executive had been permanently damaged, replaced by a wariness that would color all their future interactions. The scars from this battle ran deeper than anyone realized at the time. Marvin found himself second-guessing every creative impulse, wondering whether his next idea would trigger another confrontation. The spontaneity that had once characterized his approach to music making was replaced by a calculated caution that drained some of the joy from the creative process. He began to think of himself as an artist in occupied territory, always watching for signs that his captors might change their minds about allowing him freedom. The dynamic between Marvin and Barry never fully recovered its former ease. Conversations that had once flowed naturally became stilted and formal, each man carefully measuring his words to avoid reigniting the conflict. The partnership that had created so much beautiful music had been transformed into a business relationship marked by mutual respect, but also mutual suspicion. Both men knew they needed each other, but neither could forget how close they had come to ending everything over artistic principles. The triumph of What's Going On also came with a burden that Marvin hadn't anticipated. Having proven that he could create commercially successful music with social consciousness, he was now expected to repeat that achievement. Every subsequent album would be measured against the standard he had set, creating pressure to constantly address weighty topics even when he might prefer to explore other creative territories. The artistic freedom he had fought for had become a new kind of cage, one that demanded profundity rather than frivolity. In the years that followed, Marvin would often reflect on those months of conflict as a turning point that had transformed him from a performer into an artist. He had discovered that he was willing to risk everything for his creative integrity, but he had also learned that victory in such battles often came with unexpected costs. The music industry had revealed itself to be a place where art and commerce engaged in constant warfare, where every creative decision was ultimately subject to financial calculation. The legacy of what's going on extended far beyond its commercial success or critical acclaim. It had proven that soul music could address serious subjects without losing its emotional power, that Black artists could speak directly about social issues without alienating mainstream audiences. But perhaps more importantly, it had demonstrated that sometimes the most meaningful artistic achievements required artists to risk everything they had built, to choose principle over security, truth over comfort. Marvin never forgot the feeling of sitting in that conference room, staring at a demo that contained his deepest convictions, while being told it would never be released. That memory would haunt him through all his subsequent successes and failures, a reminder that the things most worth saying were often the things others were most reluctant to hear. The album had made him rich and famous, but the battle to release it had cost him something more valuable: the illusion that artistic integrity and commercial success were naturally compatible. The fluorescent lights in Conference Room B had long since been replaced, but their harsh illumination had revealed a truth that would follow Marvin for the rest of his career. In the music industry, as in life, the most important victories were often the ones that felt like defeats, and the price of speaking truth was usually higher than anyone wanted to pay.